welcome. Thank you for joining me today. We're starting a brand new unit this week on Moses. I bet you've heard his name. He was a very famous Old Testament prophet and a very important person to the Hebrew people. You're going to enjoy his story. He has lots of action and adventures and miracles and plagues, and it's going to be a wild ride. But this first lesson that we'll do this week, we're going to look at his background. We're going to look at him, how he got his start. And women play a very important part in his story. Join me.
So where do we find these stories of Moses in the Bible? They're found in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th books of the Old Testament. These books come after the book of Genesis, which is where we found Abraham's story, and they're found in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We're first introduced to Moses in the book of Exodus. The word Exodus means a going out, a departure or immigration, usually of a large number of people. And that's exactly what happens in the stories of Moses. The story of Moses begins in Egypt, a land in the northern part of the continent of Africa. The land there is primarily a sandy desert. And yes, you will find camels there. You may remember that Abraham had traveled to Egypt during times of famine in Canaan. But wait, Miss Lee, you said the land is a desert. How can they grow food there? Well, the mighty Nile River flows through the land of Egypt, allowing bountiful crops to be grown with the water from that river. This river is actually going to play a part in our story today. And before I start the story, here is one more note. You will hear me use the words Hebrew, Israelites, and Jewish in Moses' story. These words all mean essentially the same thing. They're referring to the descendants of Abraham, God's chosen people. Before we actually start the story, let's get a little background into what has happened since Abraham's time. Now, Jacob was the son of Isaac, and you'll remember that Isaac was Abraham's son. Well, Jacob's son, Joseph, became an important person in Egypt because he had a gift for explaining the meaning of dreams, and therefore he was respected by the Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt. Many other Hebrew people, the descendants of Abraham, had moved to Egypt when food was hard to find. They worked alongside the Egyptians, and for many years both groups of people lived in harmony. Well, time passed, and new pharaohs took over leading Egypt. Pharaohs who did not remember how important Joseph and the Hebrew people were. These pharaohs disliked having so many foreigners living there. There are too many of them. They may take over our land. So the Pharaoh set the Hebrew people to work as slaves. Working as a slave for no money was extremely punishing for the Hebrew people. And yet still, the Hebrew people grew in numbers. The Pharaoh became frightened that the Hebrew people might overthrow his leadership or join with an enemy to destroy his country. So he decided to reduce the numbers of the Hebrew people by getting rid of all newborn Hebrew baby boys. We're going to pick up our story here with a reading from the Children's Bible in 365 stories. A new baby boy. How happy his mother Jochebed and father Amram would have been, but for the latest law of the cruel Egyptian king. Families were required to get rid of every newborn Israelite or Hebrew boy. Jochebed looked at her beautiful baby. "I cannot get rid of him," she said. "I shall hide him. I know God will keep him safe." At first all went well, but the tiny baby soon grew into a big, bouncing one. And his cries grew louder. As she hushed him asleep, Jochebed prayed and thought and planned. Then she began making a cradle from the river reeds, just like the fishermen made their boats. When it was finished, she smeared the outside with tar to keep it waterproof. While the baby slept, she put him into the cradle and carried him to the water's edge, taking his sister Miriam with her. Jochebed placed the basket among the tall reeds and, leaving Miriam to keep watch, sped quickly home. Still as a mouse, Miriam crouched in her hiding place and waited. The princess, one of the Pharaoh's daughters, was coming to bathe, attended by her slaves. As Miriam watched, her heart beating fast, the princess stopped. "Look," she said, "there's a basket in the reeds. Fetch it." Her slave waded in, picked up the basket, and handed it to the princess. At that, the baby woke up, gave a look at the unknown face, and burst into tears. "Poor little thing," said the princess gently. "He must be an Israelite baby." Her kind look gave Miriam courage. She stepped bravely forward. "Would you like a nurse for the baby?" she asked. "Yes," said the princess, and Miriam hurried home and fetched her mother. The princess looked keenly at Jochebed. Then she said, "Take this baby and look after him for me. I will pay you. When he is older, he shall come to the palace and be brought up as my son. I shall call him Moses." Happily, Jochebed and Miriam carried the gurgling baby home. They need not worry who saw him now. God had kept little Moses safe. For a few more years, he was theirs to keep and care for. Jochebed took good care of her baby son. As he grew older, she told him about the true God who had saved him from death and would care for him, even in the king's palace. One day God would rescue all his people from their hardship and slavery. The day came for Moses to go to the palace to the princess. There he was dressed in fine Egyptian cotton, ate the best food, and was waited on by slaves. Soon he began lessons, reading and writing, and many things besides, for the Egyptians were wise and learned. But although he grew up to look like an Egyptian, he never forgot that he was an Israelite. He remembered and loved the God of his own people. When he went out in his fine chariot, he felt angry and sad to see his own people toiling and sweating in the scorching sun, making the grand buildings the Egyptian king was proud to own. He longed to rescue them from their cruel masters. One day, his chance came. One of the Egyptians beat up an Israelite slave. Moses saw it and was furious. He glanced quickly around. No one was about, so Moses killed the Egyptian bully and buried his body in the soft, sandy soil. Next day, Moses was horrified to come upon two of his own people fighting one another. "Stop," he said. "You are both Israelites." "Who do you think you are?" asked the man who had started the quarrel. "Are you going to kill me like you did that Egyptian yesterday?" Moses' secret was out. Soon the story spread to the palace, and the Pharaoh was very angry. He tried to have Moses put to death. So Moses left his princely finery and wealth and fled for his life into the deserted countryside of Midian. His own people, whom he longed so much to help, would not have him for their prince and leader. As I mentioned earlier, this story of Moses' early life really has women in important roles. There's his mother, Jochebed, who did all she could to hide and protect her son. There's his older sister, Miriam, who bravely followed Moses on his journey down the Nile River. She was brave enough to speak up to Pharaoh's daughter. She was smart enough to realize that the Pharaoh's daughter would require a nurse for the infant, and she was clever enough to bring her mother for the job. And there's Pharaoh's daughter, whose tender heart was touched by the cries of an infant, and who took the child of slaves, into her home to raise him as her own. All these women showed how much they care for the safety of Moses, much like the adults in your lives seek to keep you safe. Do you recognize these things? Yep, these things are just a few of the ways your family shows you that they love you, care for you, and want to protect you. Now, Moses was a very important person in Jewish history. These 4 books of the Old Testament carry many stories of his life, but like many heroic figures, other stories have been created to embellish his life. These stories, passed from generation to generation, told and retold by rabbis, parents, and children, are called fables. Moses has had his share of fables about his life as his admirers try to fill in the missing years of his life that we have no biblical record of. Here is one of those fables that is used to explain why Moses was thought to have a problem speaking. In next week's lesson, we'll see where this speech problem actually plays a role in his story. Once it happened that young Moses was playing on King Pharaoh's lap. He saw the Pharaoh's colorful crown. Little Moses reached for the crown and took it off. He tossed it to the floor. Pharaoh, who was superstitious like all his fellow Egyptians, and who, in addition, was always afraid of losing his throne, asked his astrologers and counselors the meaning of this action of the infant. Most of them interpreted it to mean that Moses was a threat to Pharaoh's crown, and they suggested that the child be put to death before he could do any harm. One of the king's counselors, however, suggested that they should first test the boy and see whether his action was prompted by intelligence, or he was merely grasping for sparkling things as any other child would. Pharaoh agreed to this, and 2 bowls were set before young Moses. One contained gold and jewels, and the other held glowing fire coals. Moses reached out for the gold, but an angel directed his hand to the coals. Moses snatched a glowing coal and put it to his lips. He burned his tongue, but his life was saved. After that fateful test, Moses suffered from a slight speech defect. He could not become an orator, but his words were to carry weight with all, for it was God's words that were spoken through his lips.
Well, guys, that about wraps up this first lesson in our unit on Moses. He has had an interesting start to his journey, I think you'd agree. Before we leave, I've got a cute video from Saddleback Kids that will sort of wrap up our story. See you next week. Bye.
Stories of the Bible. Baby Moses. This is Moses. Hey-o. Moses was a descendant of Joseph's brother Levi. Hey. Joseph and his brothers had many children and grandchildren who lived happily in Egypt. Eventually, a new pharaoh came to power who knew nothing of Joseph or what he had done. This pharaoh feared the Israelites because there was a great number of them living in Egypt, so he wanted to put a stop to their prosperity. Pharaoh made the Israelites slaves. He made them work long, hard hours building up Egyptian cities. But his plan didn't work, and the Israelites grew more in number and in strength. So Pharaoh made a rule that no Israelite boy would be allowed to live in Egypt. This is where Moses' story begins. You see, when Moses was born, his mother saw that he was a special baby, and she kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer keep him a secret, she made a basket and put him in the Nile River among the reeds. Moses' sister stayed to watch what would happen to her baby brother, and soon the Pharaoh's daughter came to the edge of the river. When she saw the basket, she sent her servant to get it. When she saw the baby, she felt sorry for him, thinking he must be an Israelite baby who wasn't supposed to live. Then Moses' sister asked the princess if she would like her to find an Israelite woman to take care of the baby. So Moses' sister went and got her mother. Moses' own mother took care of him until he was old enough to live in the Pharaoh's house, where the princess adopted him as her son. And so, Moses, an Israelite boy who wasn't supposed to live, became the adopted grandson of the Pharaoh and lived in the palace as God prepared him for a great destiny that was only just starting to unfold.